previous chapter, Stargazer awakened alone among his slumbering kin, scattered across an endless grassy field, motivated by a deep desire for dialogue, possibly even with the deity revered by his tribe. He embarked on a search. His attention was caught by a fleeting glimpse of a tail behind a tree. Despite his calls, the figure vanished into the depths of the forest. Following the trail, Stargazer stumbled upon an ancient stone structure, a sight he had never before seen. The prospect that this building might be a dwelling of the divine spurred him to explore inside, where he was greeted by a night sky panorama centered around a sophisticated device for stargazing. This was such a gift for Stargazer, but he knew that this wasn't just a gift to make him happy, but it has a purpose, as he believed that their god always has a plan in mind, which he wasn't wrong. Nebula gave him this as it would lay a groundwork for technological advancement, and this was much needed, especially when there is a new threat approaching. It was clear to Nebula that the Knoll tribe belonged to another player rather than an NPC, and now that Nebula's preparations for war with a player is complete, he would like to welcome this player with open arms. Now on to the next part. Nebula had been fairly busy for the past few years. He had to take caution of the players that were slowly starting to expand their areas. To keep that in check, he invested a lot in his small area insects. RECAPS clan was so far away that they weren't even aware. But Nebula had 3 groups of insects. Initially they were merely labeled as groups, but Nebula set a name for each of the insect groups using tags. The first group of insects, named Association, which were swarms of locusts. Unlike in the past, when the locusts were used to help RECAPS, there was more than one swarm of locusts now. They were no longer only active in the peninsula, but also the wilderness connected to the peninsula, the continents and mountain regions that extended from the wilderness, and the rivers that flowed to the north. The locust swarms would go far and wide anywhere in those regions during seasons where locusts were active. This was possible because Nebula had made a creature to control the groups of locusts through the essence farming he had done. Association followed the creature's orders and attacked other players that Nebula hadn't directly encountered himself. But Nebula did control the severity of the attacks so that they wouldn't be fatal. That way, the other players won't be able to tell the difference between his attacks and the locust attacks that naturally arise from game events. In the Lost World, it wasn't possible to distinguish if a simple event came from the system or had been conjured by another player. Experienced players would be able to somewhat guess that Nebula's locust attacks weren't game events, but that was okay to Nebula, as he was doing well hiding in the outer areas of the peninsula without encountering the other players. The evil reputation of Nebula's locusts groups had spread among the players that did agriculture in the center of the continent and along the northern coasts. They all suspected that there was someone with small area insects, but only turned their gazes to players around themselves, and never thought that it would be Nebula, who wouldn't even benefit from the attacks immediately because he was located so far away. Little did they know, he was doing this because letting the players doubt each other makes them lose trust within one another, which makes them less likely to form alliances. Technological advances are also too fast in agriculture once roads are pioneered. Keeping distance is the only way, so this is worth using his faith points for. The second insect group was a mixed group of insects named Host. Nebula had used them to attack the Frogmen tribe by the lake, but they were barely active now, just like the creature Nebula made to lead Association. The leader of Host was persistently gathering diseases that Nebula wanted to obtain, as Nebula believed that this particular group of insects would become very useful later on. And the last group of insects Nebula had was also a mixed group, and they were called Nest. Nebula had created this group to farm XP for his small area insects. This group mainly consisted of ant hills and beehives, which were taking over the ecosystems in the southern peninsula, located at the southmost side of the wilderness. There was no creature that led Nest, but Nebula thought it would eventually be necessary to have one. Not only that, the surrounding lizardmen tribe had already submitted to RECAPS. This naturally gained the upper hand over the other tribes. So everything is coming together one by one. Taking control of the southern peninsula is a matter of time. The only problem now is to deal with the player who is acting out. While Nebula contemplated his strategic approach, Owen and Hui reached the black-scaled lizardman tribe sooner than expected. They had expected them to have moved further along, but seeing the huts that had been built, and they heard wailing. Owen had an idea what happened, and what kind of funeral it was by the looks of it, as the black-scaled lizardmen held different funerals for individuals of different statuses. It was clear that one of the chosen ones has died, and so Owen asked one of the lizardmen passing by who it was that had died, and soon the answer was given to him. It was Stargazer, and we have heard about Stargazer before, so he knew this wasn't the right time for a stranger come and visit, and so he suggested to leave. To his surprise, Owen shook his head and assured him that it's okay, as they don't think it's bad for a traveler to come when they have funerals. They actually believe it's good luck. since it's good to have one more person to share sadness with, and they will talk about Stargazer all night today. Once the sun rises tomorrow, he will understand their sadness, so he should just come along. Hui pondered for a moment and nodded. Owen and Hui passed through the tents and walked to the place where the funeral took place. All the black-scaled lizardmen recognized Owen, so the two of them were able to get to the funeral without any problems. After seeing all the lizardmen through the tents, Hui saw a dead body that was set ablaze on top of a platform, and in front of the body was a lizardman with a good physique and buffalo horns on his head. The lizardman wasn't wearing anything overly decorative or of a unique color, but it could be discerned from how the other lizardmen treated him that he was someone of high stature, and Hui guessed correctly. It was the lizardman tribal chief RECAPS. But what caught his attention more is that he could see the tears flowing down on his face. This prompted him to ask Owen if it's okay for a tribal chief to shed tears. At those words, Owen immediately turned his head to Hui as if he couldn't understand what Hui meant. In turn, he asks Hui if humans don't cry when they are sad, which Hui clarified that they do. Their chiefs cry as well, but human chiefs would not cry in front of others, because they have their reputations. Fortunately enough, Hui did not have to explain what reputation meant. Owen had met lots of humans as a vagrant, so he knows what reputation is. It is not too difficult to understand. If the tribal chief shows a weak side, the warriors will think the chief is a weak person. But lizardmen doesn't think like that, since there is something they consider more important than reputation. Owen and Hui saw tears rolling down RECAPS' face and dripping on the floor. When Hui was about to ask what was more important, RECAPS turned around to face Owen and Hui. RECAPS gently wiped his tears with his thumb and welcomed them. After they finished their small conversation, RECAPS immediately asks Owen about the human friend next to him, prompting him to explain who Hui was and why he was here. Hui then bowed to RECAPS in courtesy and formally introduced himself. RECAPS looked down at Hui and beckoned Owen over. RECAPS and Owen had a couple whispered exchanges with each other, and Hui, who had good vision and good hearing, tried to eavesdrop on what they were saying, but couldn't hear anything. RECAPS then smiled at Hui and invited him to his tent. And Hui doesn't have a good feeling about this, but he was somewhat prepared for what might happen. He wouldn't be surprised if lizardmen warriors jumped out and attacked him from the tents, or if RECAPS drew his sword. However, no such thing happened, and Hui entered the biggest tent with RECAPS, now that they were alone. RECAPS apologized to Hui for this rough welcoming. He must be tired from the long journey. Unfortunately, they couldn't prepare much as they have to spend a long night as well, so they will have to get straight to business, which Hui understood, and this was also in favor for him. Now that was cleared up. Hui respectfully took out a pouch from his pocket and handed it to RECAPS. This is a gift from the Lord of Automation to RECAPS. RECAPS opened the pouch. There seemed to be a muted white piece of rock inside. As soon as RECAPS held it in his hand, he knew what it was right away. It's rock salt. RECAPS knew it was not just a simple gift. Salt itself was a precious thing, while giving a lump of rock salt the size of a fist as a present was more of an insult. But RECAPS knew the Lord of Automation didn't intend to insult him with this. There were things that gave context to the gift. Automation wasn't simply just an ancient ruin built in a remote place. Inside Automation was a salt mine. The humans inside Automation weren't very strong, so the amount of salt they could mine wasn't much. But it was still salt. Salt was an important resource, especially in livestock farming. Carnivores and omnivores were able to maintain their sodium levels in their bodies by eating other animals, but that wasn't the case for herbivores. Herbivores wouldn't be able to maintain sodium levels in their body just by eating plants. Therefore, herbivores would consume minerals by licking rocks that had salt on them and also swallowed soil. However, in cases where herbivores were artificially fed by people and continued to travel long distances, they would rarely, if ever, have the chance to consume the minerals they needed. Herbivores that lacked sodium in their bodies would vomit or have upset stomachs due to hyponatremia and eventually die due to kidney failure. Salt was especially important to those that were pregnant. Once the black-scaled lizardmen got on track with livestock farming, they continuously required excessive amounts of salt. Salt was also used for things other than livestock farming. Not only was it used for seasoning food when cooking, it was also needed to preserve food. It had become increasingly difficult to rely only on smoking as the black-scaled lizardmen's livestock herd got larger. Salt was also used for chemical treatments, such as dye or leather tanning, and it was used for washing things and when holding funerals. Other uses included fertilizer or even currency. But the black-scaled lizardmen didn't use salt for these purposes, and a lot of supply comes from automation, since salt from the far coast was not affordable because it was too expensive to bring inland, and the supply from salt lakes was lacking as there weren't too many salt lakes around. That made automation the largest salt producer in the area, and the fact that a lump of rock salt was given from such a place means the humans are plotting something. As RECAPS was in deep thought, Hui, whose face is partially concealed by his beard and the leather hood he wore, smiled as he claimed that this is the first rock salt that the Lord of Automation is giving RECAPS for nothing in return, which made RECAPS grin, as he knows all too well what the human in front of him was saying. The first time means there would be a second and a third, and there will be even more after that. And looking at how Hui smiled with confidence, RECAPS accepted with a grin and held the rock salt in his hand, and then clenched his fist that was holding the rock salt, shattering the rock salt into pieces, leaving the human in front of him flabbergasted beyond words. RECAPS then asked Hui while shaking his hand to tell the Lord that he has received the gift well, which in turn made Hui clench his teeth as he questioned RECAPS' actions, prompting RECAPS to clarify to Hui that the significance of his gesture might be lost on someone without a deity. In their culture, scattering a bit of rock salt on the ground is a way to please their god. He implied that Hui, hailing from a society without a god, might not understand this ritual. And RECAPS was right. The humans of Automation did not have a god, but Hui knew that was a brazen lie. Still, Hui retained his composure and pointed out to RECAPS that the salt this time was different, as it was a gift from the Lord of Automation. But RECAPS didn't care about such a thing. He remained indifferent and just replied that it's just a small lump of rock salt, and he used it well, so it must be enough for their lord. However, this wasn't enough of an explanation to Hui, since that's not what the gift meant, as he already told him that the Lord of Automation promised there would be a second and third time and even more, and the size would be bigger. But RECAPS just showed to Hui how uninterested he was about that lump of salt. But still he admits that Hui is right though, so he hopes that next time Hui will bring a lot more to trade. And with this, Hui almost yelled in anger. However, it was not that they weren't seeing eye to eye because they were a different species. RECAPS completely crumbled the lump of rock salt that Hui gave him. While RECAPS' actions were rough, it was not rude per se as a way to complete the diplomatic procedure. In the end, RECAPS did receive the salt and use it. There was nothing the Lord of Automation could say. This could only be done by an experienced lizard, and so Hui swallowed his anger. But before he could say anything, RECAPS stood up with disinterest and looked out the tent. He seemed to be looking at the stars as he asks Hui to consider heading back home now. But Hui wasn't willing to do that. He can't just go back like this. With this, RECAPS decided to be blunt with Hui, telling Hui how he don't really enjoy saving one's face and finding hidden meanings in words. He doesn't really get that diplomacy thing. Nor does he like it, as he likes direct conversations better. Now that was cleared up, we followed what RECAPS wanted, and be blunt asking straight to the point why RECAPS rejected his lord's offer. With his arms crossed, RECAPS raised a finger, clarifying to him that first of all, he doesn't like accepting offers that others have rejected. If someone else has turned it down, it means the offer wasn't worth it. It might be a better offer for him, but it's still something to reconsider. This revelation caused Hui's eyes to widen in disbelief, as he had not expected such discernment from RECAPS. Attempting to salvage the situation, Hui insisted that the offer was exclusively for RECAPS, but RECAPS countered with evidence that suggested otherwise. Owen already informed him that he came from the north, not the west. That means Hui came from the wilderness, not Automation, and across the wilderness is the Ears Cut tribe. And he bets that he made the same offer to Salkite, but got rejected. Hui listened to RECAPS without saying anything, which meant that he was right on the mark. And so RECAPS continued, the other reason why he rejected is that he doesn't respect liars, because the man in front of him is not an errand boy of Automation, but the Lord of Automation himself, Hui Seo. And now that the cover is up, he would like Hui to tell him something more honest.